In the very early morning hours of August 13th, 2018, Christopher Watts committed familicide when he murdered his wife Shanann, 34 and 15 weeks pregnant, and daughters Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3. Later that morning he disposed of their bodies at his petroleum industry field worksite. When repeated attempts by friends and professional associates to reach Shanann were unsuccessful, and she missed an appointment with her physician, genuine concern quickly set in. From Chris's first contact with law enforcement, who were called to conduct a welfare check at the Watts' Frederick, Colorado home, his glib indifference to the seriousness of the situation made him an immediate suspect. Watts claimed that after an emotional conversation about the state of their marriage, his wife had taken the kids for a play date with a friend. Considering that Shanann left behind her vehicle with car seats, purse, cell phone, medication, and even her wedding ring, Chris's playdate narrative didn't come close to ringing true. As concern for his family grew and the case took on greater urgency, Watts' story was a nightmare of speculative improbabilities and a poorly executed strategy of misdirection and obfuscation. Watts, though tragically lethal, was also shockingly inept. As the investigations surrounding the whereabouts of his missing family intensified, scrutiny of his implausible story, coupled by his general insouciance, began to alter the tone, pace, and focus of the investigation. After lengthy questioning by local, state, and federal authorities, including both the Colorado Bureau of Investigation (CBI) and the FBI, and several troubling interviews with local press, Watts agreed to sit for a polygraph examination. After the examination, Watts was informed by authorities that he'd not only failed the polygraph, but that he was staggeringly inept at deception. Whether his results were reported accurately or he was bluffed, he quickly began to unravel. Watts had told several versions of the murders and what occurred, including a fictional and idiotic version in which he claimed to have killed Shanann in a blind rage response to Shanann murdering the couple's young daughters. But eventually, Watts confessed to murdering his family. As part of Chris's confession and plea deal with the Weld County, Colorado's DA, Shanann's family asked that the prosecution set aside the possibility of Chris Watts receiving the death penalty. Watts will live the rest of his life in prison. During the initial investigation of his then missing family, authorities discovered that Watts had been involved in an ongoing 2-month affair with a 30-year-old female co-worker. Her name is Nicole Kessinger, and she might be the most hated woman in America. While Kessinger initially found Chris's playdate story believable, there was a lot about the reality of his marriage that she did not know. She would soon have to confront the very real possibility that Watts was responsible for his family's disappearance. After Watts was arrested for the murder of his family, Nicole Kessinger realized the massive implications of having engaged in their affair. To that end, she attempted to downplay the seriousness of the affair and delete electronic links and evidence of the affair. It didn't look particularly good, but it was absolutely understandable, given the very intimate and personal nature of their communications. It was self-preservation, and it was unapologetically efficient. It raises some questions, but it doesn't come close to painting her as an accomplice to a triple murder. As such, authorities have not charged Nicole Kessinger with a single crime related to the murders of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. Not a single criminal charge. Prior to the confession that led to his being sentenced, Watts never came close to suggesting that anyone else was involved in the planning, commission, or concealment of his murders. One of the most fascinating and sadly overlooked aspects of Nicole Kessinger's proximity to such a horrible crime is less about who she is as a person and more about what she came to represent to the case in relation to the victims and the motivation of their husband, father, murderer. In a number of comments and opinions found in various social media posts, video comments, sections, discussing Kessinger's part in the case, people tend to avoid trying to understand Kessinger as a person. I'm not surprised. The totality of her life has been edited down to a moment of her life. This moment of her life strikes at the very core of what those who hate her most need most from her. To enhance their understandable outrage directed at Watts, some have felt compelled to bolster their social media skank-hunting credibility by insisting that Kessinger, even if not directly involved, is no less guilty than Watts himself. In the need to understand the why of such a terrible crime, they need the fuse and the match that provided the spark. They need Kessinger to be a shallow and reprehensible family-jacking whore with no morals and no integrity. Once she is all of these things, it requires just a small step forward to call her a murderer. And even if the latter is never legally proven, they draw comfort from her ethical failure related to the former. Thinking of her as a flawed human being who willingly got involved in an affair with a then married man, who spent a great deal of his time convincing her that his marriage was fractured and damaged beyond repair, humanises her. Those who advocate for her being convicted are always more sure of the need for a desired outcome than they are about legal requirements and due process. The wild idea that a man capable of murdering his wife and young children might also be capable of manipulating a female colleague into believing that his marriage was terminally wrecked is completely lost on them. That Kessinger was naive, impetuous, and far too romantically optimistic is a fair charge. But even if true, it's miles away from legal or moral responsibility for the obliteration of a family. Those who hate Nicole Kessinger for participating in an affair often seem incapable of separating the affair from the murders. This is usually sidestepped in a blizzard of nonsensical word salad that nearly always fails to acknowledge that what they really want isn't feasible. They want to lock away what she represents. She represents the very rational fear of profound personal betrayal. Haven't we all had moments of anxiety as it relates to the fragility of marital relationship fidelity? And doesn't that fear strike at the very things, esteem, self-confidence, self-worth and trust, we attempt to protect most? Once the terrible truth about Watts and the savage murder of his family was flashed to our media-saturated lives, case canon was inevitable. Justice for the murdered was rightfully demanded. But what of the other woman? The hatred and suspicion was automatic. Again, what followed was predictable. She did this. She caused this. She has blood on her hands. She is just as guilty as Chris. That small step taken, presumption of innocence, was replaced by an assumption of guilt. The initial script read, because Kessinger participated in an affair with a married man who then killed his wife and kids, she too is guilty. She seduced him. He's the monster, but she was in the lab cooking up the psychopathy. This is what happens when you target and stalk a beautiful family. She's evil, awful, disgusting. Once on a roll, the insult adjective damn usually fails, flooding the landscape with invective. And that family would probably be alive today if she hadn't forced her way in. She used her body and sexuality to lure him. She wanted what Shanann had. This is basically the blindfolded masses, drunkenly and wildly swinging at logical fallacy paratus. Not only does this provide a disgusting level of cover to Chris Watts, it ignores the deeper questions. If an 8-week affair caused an otherwise mentally healthy father and husband to annihilate his family, why is this outcome the exception and not the rule as it pertains to infidelity? If some hold that Watts killed his family in order to secure a relationship with a willing Kessinger, why can't the argument be made that he might well have killed them in order to change the mind of an unwilling Kessinger? We know some of the specific circumstances that led to his decision to kill his family. What we do not know is what other scenarios that didn't involve Kessinger might have led to the same crimes but for a different reason. Cowardice doesn't require a high bar for justification. The narrative set, many thought it would only be a matter of weeks before Kessinger would be arrested and tried as an accomplice. But it didn't happen. Unwilling to even entertain the idea that authorities simply found no evidence that warranted criminal charges, newly created YouTube channels offered the 120-minute criminology degree with a minor in identifying each of the 2,327 distinct facial twitches that prove guilt, home security cameras and pixelated images of red cars, cell tower pings, analysis provided by people who don't understand cell phone tower pings, deleted text, pawn shop rings, and Kessinger's Google searches will finally produce the anticipated mugshots. Still, it didn't happen. It still hasn't, probably won't. The narrative was dead. Hate with a karma chaser has replaced evidence and truth. One of the many problems of viewing Kessinger in this light is that it leads to believing that we can right a moral failure with a judicial solution. Hubris then leads some to believe that it is their duty to collect on that moral debt. I've read thousands of comments that prove this very point. A comment I read a few months ago read, "Even if she didn't actually participate in the murders, she caused them. She should be sent to prison for life." Another measured and not at all hysterical comment read, "I don't even care what they arrest her for as long as she's convicted. What an absolute shit show of stupidity." On the fringes of Kessinger haters, there are people who wouldn't lose a moment of sleep if Kessinger was hauled to Salem, Massachusetts and tried for being a witch. And even if most would argue against it going quite that far, a number of people are absolutely fine with her forced social isolation and hiding. For others, her personal shame is actually a source of happiness. Talk about low standards. Their personal glee in the isolation of a person who hasn't been accused, tried, or convicted of a single crime says something more troubling about them than it does about Kessinger. Some argue that one of Kessinger's biggest failures is that she hasn't proven that she is innocent of involvement in the murders. They argue that she should have to take a polygraph. Sometimes they go on to argue that she should apologise for the affair. Arguments like these are the result of people becoming obsessed and manic in their belief that Kessinger owes anyone anything, or that anything she did would change a single made-up mind. Our legal system requires the state prove a defendant guilty, not that a person who hasn't even been charged prove their innocence. And even if she tried, it would be a disaster. If Kessinger wrote 1,000 letters of apology and passed 20 polygraph tests, the very people who demanded she do so wouldn't be moved in the least. No polygraph? She's guilty and afraid to submit to a polygraph. She'd be caught lying. Multiple passed polygraph tests. See, she's so sociopathic, she learned how to beat them. She's even more evil than we thought. An odd phenomenon is now occurring as it relates to Kessinger, Chris Watts and Shanann Watts. So much of the visceral hatred of Kessinger has given fuel and cover for a coward in a Wisconsin maximum security prison to once again look for a woman to blame for his actions. Those who continue to put even a portion of his crimes on his former mistress are reducing his culpability. I imagine that he enjoys that. First he blamed Shanann for killing his daughters, and now some are allowing him to blame Kessinger. Congratulations, way to give him a small measure of peace. As long as people refuse to hold him accountable for every aspect of his crimes, he feels less culpable. Kessinger has been investigated by multiple law enforcement agencies and not a single charge has been filed. If that changes, we will see what the state has, and if tried, what a jury finds. But until then, she is guilty of having participated in an affair with a garbage human being who murdered his family. The affair was his responsibility to stop. He was married. He had taken marriage vows. He was responsible. Every time I read a single comment about how Kessinger seduced him and was basically a force of nature that Watts couldn't resist, I feel the onset of a crushing headache. That line of reasoning plays right into his hands. Because if Kessinger really was something so strong that against his will he was pulled into an affair, then just wait for him to argue that Shanann, being a type A personality that made him feel unappreciated and small, played a part in his killing her. If he is allowed to be super weak when it comes to Kessinger, he'll argue the same as it relates to Shanann. Those who continue to wish all manner of misery and plague to befall Miss Kessinger are free to harbour such wishes and thoughts. But then, doing so doesn't honour the memories of a murdered mother and her children. It's the reflexive slashing at a curtain that hides behind it a simple truth. Chris Watts murdered his family because he wasn't enough of a man to address and deal with his problems. In Nichol, a damaged man found a damaging escape. In Chris Watts, Kessinger thought she had found a chance at her own version of happiness. That she was one of the many people in his life who couldn't detect the danger in his desperation doesn't make her responsible for that danger becoming lethal. Kessinger doesn't begin a relationship with Chris because she wanted to be the co-author of a broken marriage. She believed that she found Chris, leaving a marriage already broken. He is responsible. He alone is responsible. Absent a needle, an easy-to-hit vein, and a cocktail of drugs that would have paralysed his diaphragm and stopped his heart, he's where he should be. He doesn't have the right to expect compassion that he has manufactured by way of manipulation. And Nicole Kessinger doesn't deserve a life sentence of bitterness and blame for a crime she did not commit.